Hi everyone, Clara is here again. Welcome to Difference Frames the World, a demonetized channel to see the world differently. As usual, we thank supporters for helping DFTW survive so long since YouTube suspended our channel's monetization 9 months ago. Their donations make the channel stand out as we do not have to tell lies and distort facts to get funded. We are glad to remain politically wrong in the West, even if discussing China and the Chinese people from another perspective is unacceptable. Today we continue with the third episode of the United Kingdom, focusing on the relations between China and the UK. Many countries' national leaders attended Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, and China sent its vice president, Wang Qishan, to see the Queen off as well. Several days ago, the media reported that the UK had refused the Chinese delegation's request to visit the Queen's body, which the Chinese side has not officially acknowledged. Lindsay Hoyle, Speaker of the House of Commons of the British Parliament, publicly stated that he had rejected the request of the Chinese representative to enter Westminster Hall to bid farewell to the body of Queen Elizabeth II. The relationship between Beijing and London is at its lowest point since the country followed the US closely to counter China in many areas, particularly on the Hong Kong issue. Because Britain interfered with China's internal affairs in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, China sanctioned several British officials in 2021. Still, China wanted to mend its relations with the UK, so it sent its vice president to London. It sounds ridiculous that British politicians regard their country as a democracy, but it had a queen, and now it has a king. And the king is the queen's son, and he becomes king because he has a mother from the royal family. They label China as a dictatorship and criticize Chinese President Xi Jinping for seeking a third term. Still, the Chinese leader will least likely pass his leadership to his daughter, as the royal family in Britain does. Queen Elizabeth reigned the United Kingdom for 70 years, and it was not a result of democracy. China has had 7 national leaders since 1949, all bearing different family names. Suppose politicians from the so-called democratic countries are okay with their allies having kings or queens, like Denmark, Spain, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, to name a few. Why should they point fingers at a Chinese leader who wants to manage the country for another 5 or 10 years? Western governments cannot fight the epidemic and tackle the economic crisis, nor can they appease their people. Hence, they follow the US government's suit and constantly anger China and Russia to divert their people's dissatisfaction abroad. Among all those countries is the United Kingdom, which is the most arrogant and aggressive. They refused Chinese representatives to visit the Queen's body in the Palace of Westminster, and only gave the Japanese king and empress 2 seats. Thus, the Japanese prime minister found him an excuse to visit the United Nations in the US instead. It was a royal event, and many democratic countries' kings and empresses, or queens and their partners, went to bid Queen Elizabeth II farewell. Here is a tricky question. In a democratic country like the UK, Japan, Denmark, Belgium or Norway, among others, are the monarchs equal to those countries' citizens? Canadians are asked to show loyalty to the British sovereign, whether a queen or a king. The same should also be true for other British Commonwealth members. Some challenged the new old King Charles III that they could not pay energy bills. Still, as taxpayers in Britain and previous British colonies, now Commonwealth nations, they had to foot the bill for the accession of His Majesty. No one expects King Charles III to solve problems with his sausage fingers in Britain or 14 other member states. His Majesty could hardly explain why his subjects should hold a grand ceremony for his advent in a democratic country like the United Kingdom. Of course, he never claimed him as a democratic monarch, nor did his mother. And ironically, he has no power to do anything for the country and his people. King Charles III did not refuse the Chinese delegation's request to pay the last visit to his mother. However, another guy, who is not the king, or the king's relative, with no relations with the deceased queen, publicized his refusal to accept the Chinese delegation's request. Many Chinese netizens are angry and think the UK is slapping China's face by not allowing the Chinese delegation to visit the Queen's body. They should not. London has many other attractions than a monarch's dead body. Queen Elizabeth II was a British monarch, her body was, is and will be undoubtedly Britain's asset, so it makes sense for the British Parliament to keep her remains as secretly as possible. Chinese officials and citizens can go to Britain's museums to worship their robbed possessions, which the British invaders plundered from old China. Poland is now seeking $1.3 trillion of compensation from Germany for its atrocities on the Polish nation during World War II. The Chinese can also ask the British government to return all its spoils to China. If China could force Margaret Thatcher to return the ceded Hong Kong island in the 1980s, the current Chinese government should also have the grounds to claim China's belongings from Britain's museums. Finders are keepers, but no one says robbers are keepers. Some Western politicians are afraid of China's rise because they think China might become robbers and pirates like their ancestors. The parliaments of those European countries have always followed their US counterparts closely, never considering the interests of their countries. We have to say British Parliament is not the worst, as Europe's so-called lawmakers frequently visit China's renegade island of Taiwan, peddling their so-called support for Taiwan's democracy at an ignorable price. In a previous video, we ridiculed French Parliament members visiting Taiwan for petty cash, saying that France could not defend itself from Germany's attack in World War II. However, those guys still blatantly promised the DPP government they would defend Taiwan. Will any of them go to fight with the Chinese People's Liberation Army when Beijing initiates a military takeover of the island? They will stay in Europe or run faster from Taiwan than those legless American lawmakers. Last week, we discussed why the West no longer had great leaders as before, and here we have to say, Western parliaments are also much worse than before. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has become a joke in front of the world for helping China actualize its reunification dream. The British Speaker of the House of Commons refused to let the Chinese delegation carry out the normal condolence process inside the Palace of Westminster, which slaps the face of the British royal family, indicating the Speaker is the owner of Britain and the King is not. If the Speaker represents the country, what is the value of having a monarch as the national leader? The new British Prime Minister used to advocate for abolishing the monarchy in Britain. Still, she finally bowed her head to Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III, even if she did not necessarily respect them as she seemed. Queen Elizabeth II appointed 15 British Prime Ministers, and Liz Truss was the last one. Some wonder whether she could bring bad luck to the King, whose sausage fingers were headlined after shaking hands with her. King Charles III had his sausage fingers long ago, so we cannot blame the new Prime Minister for that. Even if Liz Truss announced a new king's name someday, we still would not blame her as it might be related to the king's age and health issues. Queen Elizabeth II was gone, and so will be King Charles III and the future kings or queens, but the country and the people will continue to exist, and we hope the UK will eventually have good leaders and lawmakers. With the current government and parliament, the country will still suffer for a while before everything goes back on track. The relationship between London and Beijing is less critical than some British politicians think. China has yet to officially admit that its delegation wanted to honor the Queen's body inside the Palace of Westminster, and it may never admit it. However, it has been a Chinese tradition to glorify the dead in history for thousands of years. China's most remarkable thinker, Confucius, put the ritual of worshipping the forefathers on top of everything. He even compiled a book detailing all kinds of ceremonies for various funerals at different levels, which still influences today's Chinese funeral rites. When a Chinese passes away, his funeral will welcome all visitors, including his relatives, neighbors and even strangers, so it makes sense for the Chinese delegation to think the British may also be as courteous as the Chinese nation. It would not be a big deal even if the British did refuse the Chinese representative to pay the last visit to Queen Elizabeth's dead body. Who cares if the British do not care? From the next episode onward, we will discuss the conflicts between Britain and China in the past 200 years. And in response to many viewers' requests, we will make exclusive videos about the First and Second Opium Wars and unequal treaties signed between Britain and the Old China. Before ending episode 3 of the series, we want to thank our supporters and patrons again for their continuous support, which has kept DFTW surviving for so long in the past 9 months. Also, we need to thank YouTube's advertisers for putting advertisements on our videos, which means our videos have brought value for them to promote their products and services, even though YouTube keeps all advertisement income without paying us a penny for our work. Because of the demonetization and the financial difficulty arising from it, we will have to publish 2 videos each week, as we cannot afford to update the channel daily as before.